The term running back by committee is one all too familiar to fantasy players, both novice and veteran alike. It is a term that is met with resentment and discouragement, and typically results in an ADP fall for a player affected by it. However, not all committees and opportunities share the same, and it is important to distinguish which ones you as a fantasy player should avoid and which ones you will thrive in. My name is Luke, and today we're going to go on a journey of breaking down a backfield. The Cleveland Browns have many reasons for optimism. Whether it be their first playoff win, emerging defense, or star-studded offense, there are clearly talented players on this roster, especially at running back. However, for as much optimism that this organization has, there is a lot of divide in the fantasy community as to the value of the running backs Nick Chubb and Kareem Hunt hold. To hopefully settle this division, I will be evaluating each running back's touch share, efficiency, and progression to determine the real value of each player. On the screen now is a graph that represents the amount of touches both Kareem Hunt and Nick Chubb had in games that they both played. When these numbers are broken down, you can see that Chubb received about 56% of the touches compared to Hunt's 44%. Out of those touches, Hunt received 36 targets compared to Chubb's 17. So what does this mean? What does this mean for each player? Let's start with Nick Chubb. Well, clearly it means that Nick Chubb is not worthy of his 8th overall ADP due to the apparent split backfield, right? I mean, obviously, if I'm spending a first-round pick on a running back, I want a bell cow. I need somebody to touch the ball at least 70% of the time. I mean, I'm investing such high draft capital. Well, just because he doesn't touch the ball doesn't mean he's not worth it, as you'll see. Now, the Browns as a team the last 2 years have an incredibly similar pace of play of about 2.16 plays per minute. However, a major change that came with Stefanski in 2020 was the play calling. Now, the Browns went from 24.6 run plays per game in 2019, which ranked about 22nd in the league, to 30.9 run plays per game under Kevin Stefanski, which is 4th in the league. And that trend will likely continue, as when Stefanski was at the Vikings in 2019, they ran the ball 476 times, while the Browns last year ran the ball 495 times. So it's unlikely we will see significant negative regression in run plays. I mean, clearly it worked for them. The Browns made the playoffs for the first time in forever last year. I think they're going to stick with this formula. So, what this means is that despite a relative split in touches, there's plenty of opportunity for Nick Chubb to perform at a high fantasy level due to his offense's preference for running the ball and Nick Chubb's incredible efficiency. In fact, Nick Chubb has never finished below 5 yards per carry in a season, and last year particularly, he ran for 5.6 yards per carry. Now, you might say, Luke, there's no way he'll run for 5.6 yards per carry again. And you know what? You might be right, but I would argue that the Browns are the best offensive line in football. And if you want to say, oh, maybe it's not the best, well, it's really hard to argue that they're not a top 5 offensive line. And with that being said, I think it's very likely we will see another high floor yards per carry from Nick Chubb. Furthermore, I expect the Browns to have more positive game scripts this upcoming year. I think their team is going to be better, more collected, the defense continues to get better, and I expect them to be in the lead for a larger portion of these games this year. And as we know, when teams have the lead, they tend to run the ball, so I think that'll overall increase Chubb's volume. If you're not sold on Chubb yet, let's extrapolate Chubb's numbers from last year over 16 games. Extrapolating his numbers over 16 games, we see that Chubb would have had 240 carries for 1,344 yards and 16 touchdowns. When it's all broken down, including his receptions and receiving, we have about 259.15 fantasy points, which would have been good enough for running back 4 last year. Furthermore, he also averaged over 3 red zone touches per game, which gives him an opportunity to continue to score every single week. Every single week, Chubb is given an opportunity to get in the end zone, which is great for a running back. So clearly, despite only touching the ball about half the time, Chubb has a top 5 running back upside and is well worth a first-round pick. Now, let's evaluate the other half of this coin, Kareem Hunt. I think Kareem Hunt might be overvalued heading into 2021. Given Hunt's roughly 13 touches per game when Chubb is available, and his lackluster 4.2 yards per carry, I find it hard for Hunt to eclipse over 65 total yards per game on a consistent basis. In fact, Hunt only had 28 receptions in his 12 games with Chubb, therefore you can't really rely on his receiving upside to make up for his limited rushing. And now currently, Hunt is projected at about a 4th round ADP, And to reach that value, I feel like we would have to see another Chubb injury, and I don't want to draft someone banking on someone else being hurt unless it's like I mean, I guess it could be you could draft him as a handcuff, but you really want to draft a handcuff in the 4th round? Probably not. With this being said, given that he has such limited upside, it doesn't really make sense to draft him this high because there's still plenty of players available in the late 4th round that can significantly impact your team. I mean, he's literally being taken alongside guys like Terry McLaurin, Allen Robinson, Chris Godwin, and Clyde Edwards-Helaire, all of which present way more upside than Kareem Hunt, barring injury. I mean, just look at the graph. Hunt started to see the ball less and less as the season progressed, which could be an indication of things to come. With this being said, let's look at each player's fantasy outlook. Okay, these stats are going to be over the course of 17 games, starting with Nick Chubb. Nick Chubb's floor next year is 1,275 yards and 8 touchdowns. That would be about 75 total yards per game and almost half a touchdown per game. And I think he's going to score about 195.5 fantasy points. That includes like receptions and yards. We'll probably get about a catch a game floor, I think, But 195 points as a floor is pretty solid. Obviously, that wouldn't be first round draft talent, but it's a floor. And I really think unless he gets hurt, there's no way that Nick Chubb doesn't hit 75 total yards per game and 0.47 touchdowns a game. I just cannot see him scoring lower than that at all. Now, his ceiling, on the other hand, is obviously much higher. I think his ceiling is pretty much 270 fantasy points, give or take. I put it down here as 267 fantasy points, which is about 94 yards per game and almost a touchdown per game. So realistically, I could see him I could see his total yards being 1,600 and 16 touchdowns. So basically 22 catches, 1,600 total yards, and 16 touchdowns. I mean, he is getting those 3 red zone touches per game, which really could allow him to score a touchdown per game. I mean, realistically, he could do that. 94 yards per game is a lot, but given that offensive line and given his ability to run extremely efficiently, 94 total yards per game really isn't out of this world. With both those being said, I think realistically, he'll probably put up about 227 fantasy points, which would be about 85 yards per game and about 0.7 touchdowns per game. So I think next year, Nick Chubb will finish with 1,450 total yards and 12 touchdowns on 20 receptions. I think that is a very solid fantasy outcome and a very realistic expectation for Nick Chubb. Okay, moving on to Kareem Hunt. I think Kareem Hunt's floor is about 51 total yards per game and 6 total touchdowns. So realistically, I could see him getting about 870-ish total yards and 6 total touchdowns through 17 games. That would give him about 139 fantasy points if you include his receptions and stuff like that. I think that's a reasonable floor. I can't really see him getting any lower than this. I think even though I kind of hated on his receptions earlier, saying they wouldn't really make up for his value, I think that it'll at least give him a decent fantasy floor. And I just can't see him scoring any less than 139 unless he gets completely dropped off of the offensive script or whatever. As for his ceiling, I think, we just saw his ceiling. It's going to be nearly impossible for him to beat what he did last year unless Nick Chubb suffers a serious injury pretty early in the year. I mean, last year he had 841 rushing yards and 6 rushing touchdowns, along with 304 receiving yards and 5 touchdowns. So basically, to do that over 1,100 total yards and 11 touchdowns, or about 200 fantasy points. Yeah, I don't really see that happening either. But I mean, it has happened before, so I can't, not say this is the ceiling because it clearly is. But basically, when we break it down, I think he'll average about a little over 1,000 yards, 1,020 total yards, and 7 touchdowns on 36 receptions, which is good for about 162 total fantasy points. So, with all this being said, I think Chubb is worth a late first-round pick, and honestly, he could go as high as 5. Obviously, if you pick him at 5, his value isn't quite as high because, now he has to finish 5th or higher. I think if you can get him 8th, 9th, 10th, that's really good value. I mean, obviously, the further back you get him in the first round, the more value he has. But, yeah, I would look for Chubb if you pick in the back half of your draft this year. I really think people are down on Chubb, and I really think he could be a top 5 running back. And, yeah, I just think he's undervalued right now, honestly. And you could definitely get him in the first round, get somebody else in the turn, and be set for the season, honestly. Now, with that being said, I think Hunt is overvalued, given his negative progression that we saw on the bar. He was being used less and less as the season progressed. I think he has a limited ceiling. You have such a stud in Nick Chubb that who can run the ball so efficiently, it's hard not to just keep giving the ball to him. So I think, like, given Hunt's limited per game ceiling, I would not draft him in the 4th round. All right, that's it for this video. See ya.